Hello everyone, today we make a brief overview of late Roman armor. We will make other videos about the single pieces and typologies of armor on the basis of mostly the iconographic, archaeological evidence. Not only because, as we will see today, there is some still, historiographically, some debate, mostly around those, of course, say quantities and dimensions that we can't precisely fix and or document, but that we can definitely, in fact, expose many aspects, also theorizing how things really worked. The late Roman army, as you know, is a very important chapter. I can say at this point in history is an underrated one. Even pop culture has decided to reapproach it, not always with the, say, proper look, method, and purpose, and that is, in fact, still paradoxically, even in its in such revivals, still underestimated, especially in terms of tactical capacity. There is a philosophy that wants to see, okay, like nothing really changed, and or that nothing really went worse overall. I made different videos about the late Roman army and these sort of perception at the end of the day in general, and there is no doubt that depending also on what centuries you're talking about, the Constantinian era, say up to Adrianople, was in fact the peak tactical efficiency of the Roman army, which doesn't mean, however, that things hadn't gone transforming in the state mostly, and in the politics, the society of it, in ways that had been gradually, say, at least expressing a crisis, right, that often does actually lead to innovation. If you look even at probably the latest Romans, if you can so say, in the early Byzantine era, we realize, for example, it was a bigger deal of technological interest and investment, apparently at least by the side of the imperial military, than there had been, say, in early imperial times, even though of course we mostly identify that like the peak, probably also the absolute capacities of the Roman army, which is also true, but it also depends on what kind of factors and indicators. So it's always an interesting topic to discuss, and the one of arms and armor also does always fulfill an important function, in as much as material culture is always a powerful indicator of the current, say, culture, the current time, and it shows you properly the technical side of the story, like what was actually used in combat. It makes you wonder why, like the typologies of weapons they provided, but always bear in mind that these technologies were created by tactics, right? There is a broader context on which you have to grasp them, because they weren't per se making the thing, but they were chosen because the military had to perform specific things that they hadn't to do before. All right, so never fall into the technologistic trap, because also, say, intellectually speaking, it's not really on your credit, unfortunately, considering how widespread also these pseudo ideas are. So speaking of armor, we will surely look at things in much greater depth, again, step by step, because there is not just the single item, the single piece of equipment, but also the matter of its provision, of its production, of the external influences, but as we were just saying, also properly the inherent logic of its development in the Roman army. And it's true that there are still lots of cliches on the topic in general. For example, the widespread notion that the use of armor declined in the late Roman Empire stems notoriously from a careless citation of Vegetius' passage in Book 1, Chapter 20 of the Epitheme, that is misunderstood usually, together with a bit the entire mindset of the work, by the same author's admission in the introduction. by someone that did actually not have a military expertise, especially about the current times. Vegetius was a nostalgic in many ways. He was an intelligent guy. He's quite straightforward about this. It's rather, as always, like modern people to be the constant problem, even in front of this kind of evidence. A nostalgic who wanted to, of course, compare, let's say, the Apollonian Catholic perfection of the earlier days of the Augustan era, fundamentally one of the what were already perceived at the time, setting actually a bit that sort of defeatistic mood that eventually took root, like in thinking the late Roman army, the late Roman Empire, but also still with some grain of truth, definitely. To the fact the current times in which, according to Vegetius, the military had fallen in standards. So this is actually a very important, view by an author of such importance that, as we know also from medieval history, was essentially the only military theory read, talking military theory, because of course then was military history as well, studied in the Western Middle Ages, that in fact has been also excessively studied in function of how much did medieval armies copy from Vegetius' precept. I can tell you as a specialized in the field, like practically nothing. What is more interesting instead is the general understanding of the Roman military history from, in fact, also like the humanistic Renaissance times. It's sort of our own modern thinking of the same. Naturally, Vegetius' statement, as we were pointing out, is very poignant in many ways. You can't simply dismiss the notion that the Roman Empire was in a worse shape than it had been in the past. There was, in particular, less moral force. There was, historically, just like throughout the years, a greater, let's say, tiredness of the world, of humanity. This is not just about the empire. We tend not to picture this. We mostly think about this pseudo-cyclicity of history for which every power rises and falls. And so we picture these politics just as single cycles, sort of independent from one another, without a broader picture of what humans are actually undergoing. And actually, we talk this very often in the videos about history of religion, because of course there was all a specific relation with the divinity that at this point in history had objectively entered a crisis, right? Specifically the one of let's say reflected by the incapacity of the world rulers, the emperors, to actually keep the empire together with the same level of stability before, with the same level of also individual achievement than before. And both in the Christian and in the pagan world, actually, that notion that this leader, this hero, could save the world, redeem it, and re-achieve, let's say, the actually divine transcendence, was sort of lost, right? This is also why Christianity eventually has the upper hand over, for example, the same military religion of Mithraism. That was the actually previous deal, but in fact was meeting with a different world that Christianity understood, like the problem of, by not lying to people, saying, you can actually make it simply by wishing it, because everybody was wishing it but not succeeding in it anymore. There is a problem. There's a fundamental problem. We have to understand this at the root. And so rethink our same relation with the concept of self-sacrifice in holy combat. This, as you know, affected not the performance of the military. Remember always this, there is not a single instance in the entire Christian hagiography of a Christian soldier, was already a soldier, in a career one, towards bloodshedding. Bloodshedding was a sin, but none of the so-called military saints were being put to death because they refused to shed blood. They didn't care anything about that. Regarding their military profession, was seen as actually perfectly fine. The problem was the sacrificed to an authority that was not considered having the divine standards to, in fact, to be considered as such, and therefore being more loyal to a higher idea. This is not what we're going to discuss today, but it's important in a sense because also the type of arms and armor development could be philosophically interpreted with this greater reliance, for example, on defense rather than offense. You may think it's, what does that actually mean? Well, I mean that if you look at, for example, the Roman armies that took over the Mediterranean and much of other continents, they fundamentally were pretty light, right? They weren't anything impressive in a strictly material sense, right? It was evidently a traumatically pushing force that sprang from the Romano-Italic divine mission of world domination, all a specific sense of fact of that role, how the Romans had posed themselves religiously in function of that collective salvation. This is very important also for Christian providence, as you know, for Christ's birth and the rebooting of the cycle of the Golden Era. Now, this is just like food for thought, even a provocation, but I'm of course serious about it. I mean, I don't even need to point it out. This should always be considered when looking at the era, right? Not merely, even, yes, regarding arms and armor, a matter of material side of the story, of deterministic, in fact, materialistic, say, reasoning of why this weapon was used as opposed to another. Because you can have all the material functions of the world, but warfare, first of all, always, like, say, every war is different, every army is different, every soldier is different. We know overall a few about this, say, armament in the first place. We would like to know so much more about Roman warfare, the one of other peoples, their enemies, for example, at this time. And there is a broader philosophy that can make you picture the man, the mind, the spirit underneath this armor, and what they were fighting for, what kind of, say, force prompted them to fight and die, right? This is Clausewitzianly the most important thing, moral forces in war, right? And regarding, I think, the aforementioned Vegetzi's passage about the notion that the use of armor declined in the late Roman military, well, there is, of course, a lot could be said. Overall, I think it is correct to say that late antiquity was a less materially florid time than it had been before, which also actually matches what I was saying before regarding the earlier Roman military to have had relatively simpler armament. And there is a debate even there about the extent, for example, of armoredness in the first place, because we assume that since we know that in theory the legionnaire since Marian times had to be equipped more or less in a uniform way that contemplated essentially a heavy armor, like an entire lorica, and like the scutum is pretty large, like the helmet, etc. Like, leaving aside all the incredibly heavy gear that the Roman legionnaire surpassed like any other fighter in history, really, and in fact the spiritual superiority beats the material availability both in quality and in quantity. This is evident even just for what the Romans did, right? Starting from literally a city and taking over like a much vastly larger, richer, more populated, say, world in absolute terms in comparison. So you understand there really the connection. The idea, however, is that in late antiquity, demographic, and you see, in the ancient world, it wasn't that much shortage of demographic or economical resources, late antiquity starts being so, right? And it starts being for, say, very debatable reasons. It's not that this wasn't the case, but again, it would take like an enormous set of lessons to try even to find the answer to that simply, unless we want to, of course, think that this was too a matter, as it was for sure, like a matter of moral force involved on properly in the way the society could provide with the military, with the production of its equipment, etc. And of course the peoples that were fighting against the same Romans that are actually much more aggressive and effective, militarily speaking, than they had been before. I mean, the Romans had never met before this time the same level of of impact of an Alemannic infantry charge or the combined arms tactics of the Sasanian, Persian cataphracts, and at this point tough infantrymen, artillerists, etc. So actually the Roman army, especially in the 4th century, was really like, also in the century before, but I'd say before the collapse of the West in the 5th, there was really that standard pack sort of top-notch upper level unmatchable, right, standard that was maintained as far as, in fact, the Roman state was maintained. The Byzantine military in the 6th century was the top one, that other peoples had basically reached it in many ways. And of course we should understand how even in the previous centuries, really in fact the strictly technical material quality was not really that distant from one another. Peoples were pretty similar. Of course, it was more or less resourceful peoples, but as we said before, it's not just about material availability, because that things are not just arms and armor is not found under a tree. You must think of yourself as a world ruler to accomplish what the Roman military did as well, and so that comes with so much politically, culturally, socially, etc. The idea that I personally developed looking at Roman military is that while we can't be precisely sure about the exact quantities of armoredness in the Roman military, we do see a tendency towards at least a specialization, hyper-specialization, especially in the heavy components of the heavier components of the military, especially in the comitatenses, that were not, however, sometimes that ultras overly superior than the limitani, especially in the earlier periods. The latter had sometimes really excellent arms and armor, but tendentially, yes, the division was like that. Our uncertainty regarding the comparison with the previous centuries, that first of all, we do not really know whether the Roman legionaries, so by extent, say the entire Roman citizen military, that was fundamentally just heavy infantry, that there was few cavalrymen, was actually homogeneously armored. Right? We have no idea. Like, the theory is that yes, more or less, these forces have to be levied with the concept that there is no difference between them. It's just say juridical and administrative difference. The way eventually these armies would specialize, would say, I don't know, the first cohort apparently was the more punching one, the one would always go for it. We've just seen in the recent video about the Roman orders of battle that very often, like, very rarely you would have an entire legion on the field, even together with others, because cohorts would be left in reserve at the camp, in a properly strategical and operational point of view. And we have to consider, of course, that the auxilia in the earlier days were quite poorly equipped. I mean, the Romans eventually came to, rather than equipping them in a uniform way like the legionaries as they would arrive, like it was, as we've seen in the video about the connubium, right, and Italian genetic prevalence, that they were gradually becoming Romans. And actually, there were some Roman citizens that preferred to serve as auxiliary. And this did happen right? And not just for military reasons, because they could, for example, marry provincial women. So it's, again, complicated now. Let's not digress. But the problem there is that we see the Roman military say, oh, God, look at those early imperial legionaries. They were all armored. And then, look at the late Roman times. There's just some were armored, the majority weren't. Yes, you have to account that there were all the auxilia that before made lighter, or at least more lightly armored forces that at this point were literally, say, the same people, the same descendants at least, in the form of the entire Roman Empire having been Romanized. And so at this point, everybody was a subject with the same, more or less the same, aside from the social position, the same duties, at least towards the military. And that the Romans were actually starting to get troops mostly from, in fact, the Barbaricum, and making them in part immigrate, in part just, even hiring them temporarily. And so I will not here digress on how much do we know, say, in proportion to the entirety of the personnel, how arms and armor were actually distributed in terms of heaviness, of quality. It's an incredibly complicated topic, and this is just not the video. This video is just an overview about late Roman armor specifically. Overall, I think this is, again, my impression that there was, yes, a slight fall in the level of armoredness, but more or less it doesn't make much sense to consider the system in too much of a different one, to many different terms from the one of the previous centuries regarding armoredness, right? Vegetius said specifically that in the aforementioned passage that from the reign of Gratian, so we are actually at the moment of the crack of the Constantinian military. Gratian ruled between 367 383. When I say Constantinian here, I mean literally the system that Constantine, also with his military reforms, had established. And so the Roman army, again, at its best, especially in terms of combined arms tactics in the 4th century onwards, soldiers supposedly lost their training and began to abandon helmets and armor to their weight. Now, this phrase may seem like, oh my God, it doesn't mean anything. Like, how can a soldier abandon his helmets and armor to their weight, right? And why would they? Yes, because here they had lost their training, so the idea is that they couldn't, they would prefer to have, like, lighter kind of arms and armor. Of course, the connection doesn't make much sense. It is true, however, as we were saying before, that, yes, say the heavier you are and the sort of more trained you must be. This is actually logical as a notion. There are two ideas here. The first one is that, yes, there may have been a collapse also civilizationally with the exhaustion of moral and even bodily forces at a level that would be perceived as a difference. The second one is that this would stem from the lack, right, of motivation connected to also the loss of privilege in being a Roman and or having to fight, even as an auxilia, in an army that could reward you with, for example, more prestigious social position. Meaning, before people fought, the Roman citizens, at least from Marius onwards, had been fighting for land, right? In previous times, land was just instead the precondition in order to have the privilege of fighting, because that's what a Roman warrior does, right? At this point, instead, like, there wasn't much to gain socially from military service, right? There would be something to gain to an extent, but the majority of the recruits were, just provided without too much enthusiasm, both by them and especially the men that had already come to essentially act as their masters, right? And treating them essentially as subjects, not citizens. So there's all a technical side of this, because of course you must be motivated, you must be wanting to be that world conqueror. That when you look at the heaviest Roman panoply of the early empire, really you can kind of see, right? There is this tendency to look at the Roman legionnaire. I said it even before, at least in a strictly material sense, but people extend it to especially those who are fanatically obsessed with the idea that for some reason the Romans were just a bunch of subhumans that, were, I don't know, one barbarian was worth 10 of them. That actually having a type of panoply of like the most stereotypically possible one of the early empire, like the Italic or Gallic imperial helmet, the shingle shaped scutum, the lorica, so-called at least lorica segmentata, maybe with a manica, and greaves and all, like, is really a hell of a sort of heavy combatant, right? You have to wait an important amount of time in history before seeing that level of armoredness, and especially individual, say, professionalism. Aside from the collective training, it was objectively insane as well. And the most important thing, widespread at that level of sort of down the troop level, in fact. And that's why we were saying before that probably not all the Roman legionnaires were actually trained in that same way. And it was surely we know a shockingly violent competition within the same legion to be the better man. That also made these people like the perfect slaughtering machines. And again, Roman legionary psychology is something that, again, you don't recover from once even you learn of 20 centuries later. And we'll have to talk about it at some point. It's going to be an important moment in Schwerpunkt's history. Because it is insane, right? It is objectively insane. But in this sense, it does show exactly part of what Vegetsis was saying, that there was, again, less motivation in general to be there. There was more bureaucracy taking care of the means provision. There was a more sort of detached military career from the rest of the population. It was less rewarding. The same elites were bailing out in many ways from like that sort of public civic ideal. There was a lot of privatization, a lot of sort of literally, again, I'm out of this, right? That's also why the empire sort of came to dissipate in many regions. And so Vegetsis says something that already sounds very Byzantine, telling the truth. Like the way he writes is not exactly like how you would think like a Roman of the earlier days. It doesn't matter how nostalgic he is. I've also made a video about the Age of Order, like quoting Caesar, Tacitus, and the same Vegetsis. In fact, that sort of shows you how like Roman mindset had sort of changed. Sort of also the eastern part had at this point already come to be, of course, from Constantinian times, the more sort of compact, the more functional, right? So people say that essentially it's possible that Vegetsis' statement merely reflects an apparent increase in the use of light infantry, which is kind of true, but it's debatable as well, because of course light infantry had been existing, and not we're talking just about Republican times with the velites, with sort of the poor youth. We are talking again also early imperial auxiliary forces that actually provided the Romans with a hell of a missile capacity compared to other enemies. If anything, it's, as you know, cavalry, it's combined arms, it's something also more flattering in strictly art of war terms that really makes like the 4th century Constantinian army like the top one in terms of offensive and defensive potential. The point there that we also made in those videos about the late Roman army, describing this in general, is how much did that cost, right? Because that sort of Byzantine vibe is a bit sort of the same one that brought, and we made a video about this recently, the Hellenistic armies to field the phalanx. That was a hell of a military machine. And and with an incredible quality, but also cost disproportionately, and also with a political and social background that, in fact, was already sort of regressing compared to Alexander's model himself. So you can't just evaluate the military and this sort of the statements on the basis of why, was, at least according here, it's Vegetsu's opinion, but say why you would think that, again, there was more or less light infantry, for example, in the Roman army. Surely this doesn't mean, of course, there was an actual abandonment of armor or helmets by the Roman heavy infantry because they were sort of lazy or untrained, right? On the contrary, if you look at the Constantinian Equus, oh boy, that's something, right? That's possibly my favorite Roman legionnaire. And again, it's displaying already those characters who were equestrianly, chivalrically evolving towards something more like a medieval knighthood, right, than what it had been before the case, because this is tending towards the feudal direction, even though, especially in the Byzantine world, it wouldn't arrive, right? You know that among the largely sedentary Europeans, starting from the Italics, the Celts, the Germans, like infantry was the deal, because they were still relatively primitive, they were sort of not stratified yet, and they had yet maintaining their mythology and their identity, whatever, the sense that every freeman was a sort of knight, was with the Cingulum Militaris bearing part of the Imperium, right? The Roman legionnaire, the Roman soldier, was recognized by the fact he bore arms, first and foremost. Not the uniform was not needed, because there is a function, there is all a sort of an anthropologically modeled evidence of who is a person whose profession is exclusively about slaughtering large numbers of human beings. It's incredibly self-evident and macroscopically so. You don't need uniforms to do that. And this should make you reflect, that we've seen also in the videos about modern and contemporary warfare, about what we have become as individual types as well in history, like not just the one of warfare. These are important issues, right? Now, throughout the period when the famed Notitia Dignitatem was compiled, made a video about the Notitia. If you're interested, we will keep talking about that. So we're spanning the early 5th century. Armor and protection were produced, of course, in large quantities. And arguably in a more orderly fashion than before even, because the fabrice, or fabricae, here, like, the tongue was changing as far as we know, as you know, in late antiquity from the classical one, but were in fact a late Roman thing, right? Lots of people think that, let's say, the Marian legionnaire was essentially a guy who literally received the entire equipment from the state, and that he didn't have to pay anything from it. And when he was out there, he just kept receiving arms and armor, and it was all alike, and he had no chance of customizing, personalizing, or even producing his own equipment. This is not true. This is not true even in late antiquity, telling the truth, where, as we'll see now, that there is a greater distinction, a greater divide. Of course, we know from the time of Cicero that, of course, there were some privates, private armorers to whom the state subcontracted, in fact, the military equipment production. And so, of course, the state provided this stuff. But first of all, the stipendium still contemplated a detraction for the actual stuff that went lost, destroyed, whatever. This, of course, was just, of course, in principle of theory. Telling the truth, the Roman soldier was paid not from Marius times, but from the seizure Veii, right? Not in the same, say, homogeneous or, say, constant, reliable way, but, of course, things existed way before the sort of this strange notionistic tradition wants to make us believe. And this came all with a variety in equipment. We know that along the limes as well, in early imperial times, there were specific local styles of decorations or fashions, whatever. We will really look at this in ultra depth because we started to know, I think like in the last decades especially, there were great studies, great research made on these topics. We know now that the Roman soldier varied much more than we think in appearance, and it would have been incredibly beautiful to look at all this. While we have still the more sort of uniformed sense of, you see, the essentials were the same, like being a guy with, again, armor, shield, helmet, sword, heavy javelin, but is already the essential. Then what kind of types these are is a matter of functionalization, of practicality, but it's also sometimes a matter of personalization, customization. If you, for example, had saved some money, you wanted a better type of armor, you could buy it, you could purchase it, you could produce it yourself. The Roman legionary camps on the frontier were not awaiting for I don't know, Rome to send them just military produced stuff. This also happened, like at least there were different, again, sources of that, of those supplies, but aside from the local reserves or arms and armor, the Roman camps, the Roman legions produced arms and armor on their own. It is also kind of obvious. We'll see these things better in our video. From late antiquity instead, because mostly of the fear that provincial rebellions would sever entire parts of the empire, they would cut them off from the center, would make lots of these, in fact, materiel and men, by the way, like in the hands of the rebels. The entire political, strategic, and administrative system shifts towards the core Mediterranean area, so that you have the field armies mostly close to there with better, also better supplies. It means to psychologically regress, of course, in a sense, because the Romans, as we've seen in many videos, had really their armies like on the frontier and at the utmost stretch to, however, project themselves further, right, into at least at the same distance that separated inland, that separated them from the Mediterranean. Right? In other words, like the legions on the Rhine or on the Danube, the greatest military concentration Rome had, were meant literally to just control who lived from both sides, right, of the river for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers in depth. And of course, there was a different level of grip on it. Also a different quality of those lands, and that's why the Romans wouldn't go more distant than that. They had empirically sort of learned also at their expenses at a point, what the deal was. And in late antiquity, this thing sort of, okay, we pull back because many areas also have turned to be unproductive. It's better to settle some barbarians here that will serve as new recruits and workers, depending on what they will be doing in their life, and we maintain some sort of more attendistic attitude. The Lutvakian idea that was first a cordon defense, then a depth one, is essentially wrong. Like the Roman defense system had always been in depth. Right, it's really just what the Romans were covering now that is different. Because defense in depth was always carried in depth, and then there's no other way to do so. It can always be in depth throughout all military history, for that matter. I will not digress in this topic now, but at this point, the Roman armories are more directly framed, just like the rest of the state, under a more directly controlling fashion that, however, was not meant to produce, especially sort of massifying the level of equipment, especially having to produce this truly under a single control, which is greater than it had been in Marian times, like in parts increases this sort of greater uniformity, but also relatively cheaper value. Think about the intercisa helmet type, the idea that, again, the lighter elements still need like fewer armor, and then there are instead the heavier ones that are also a bit more privileged, that are sort of subsumed by the court, by the more that is paid by the imperial treasury factory. So again, taking on that more feudally victorial character that makes like some elite force more recognizable from the wide majority. And this is really reflected just by the Roman society at the time, right? The average freeman had impoverished dramatically, had fundamentally turned into a colonist and a subject, right? And there were just like some oligarchs that controlled the entire population orderly through as their clients, but it also had to take care in a more concentrated way of the burden of the system and trying to profit in part from this. It's a very it's a complicated story, still, however, leading to the ultimate certification of the system, and say lots of people were ever poorer and fewer people were ever richer. And this definitely, on the longer run, does not help the empire, does not help the military, and that's eventually how things sort of evaporated rather than collapsing, right? Because eventually, at least in institutional terms, because after Rome also, in many ways, also in the Byzantine system, they still managed to preserve the state after all. Everything was much more privately clientelary than before, much more feudally directed than before. This is true for the Romano-Germanic world. This is true, of course, for the same Byzantine interland. Especially look at the Bucellari, look at all these forces were technically paramilitary and or at least privately controlled. There is definitely an increase in the still in the level of foreign troops as well. So a withdrawal, a shrinking, right, that corresponds with that aforementioned demographic and economical contraction that affects also more or less the entire world. Also, the people who were out there weren't faring too well, definitely. And so there are some rocks, some strongholds of late antiquity that hold out and that manage still to provide this very qualitative forces, but still as, in fact, an elite that more or less you see operating in the Middle Ages together with mostly even serfs at a point rather than the freemen as they had been before. So the large quantities of armor that was produced in, say, the 4th century was pretty large, right? This is evident from the numerous state factories, in fact the fabrics are listed in the same Notizie Dignitatum, which were scattered throughout the empire and categorized also on the basis of what they actually produced. For example, they were known as Luricaria, or Scutaria et Armorum, or Scutaria et Armamentaria. Obviously, this referred to respectively the Lorica, the properly armor, the scutum, the shield, and the arma, mostly the offensive weapons. Of course, there were other ways of just producing, and also supplying, in this sense, the arm. Right, there was a lot of private means as well. It depended also on the type of weapon. Really, there were peoples again coming to serve in the Roman army. Mostly they were provided with arms and armor by them, but they also came with their own traditional weapon, even just by habit. By the fact you will not change that easily, and maybe after the service they would come back to wherever they lived, right? Places like, I don't know, Denmark, or or at least the Jutland at that point, that were also pretty similar again in this type of armament. Like the same Germans, the same Persians, as we've seen, had been Romanizing a big deal in their arms and armor, and in many ways the elite of these peoples was not that different. Say the Sasanian world was more strictly feudal and sort of less urbanized. But say when you look at the Germans, at least their tribal force was so compact, like in interest of rank and file warband, or at least that they were very, very resemblant to the Roman forces, also like in terms of quality, right? So that in the 5th century you have the system dissolving effectively, the Romans and the Germans equating one another. We do know that Roman units were revered in the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, some of them literally remaining before sort of blending with the rest of the system over the generations, but still bearing their standards, being used by the local monarchs in their expeditions, etc. So there is all a history of this, and you understand how you can't simply talk about late Roman armor as if were just like a standard packed one, even just compared to the one in previous centuries. As we will see now, there were certain types of armor that had been around forever, even before Roman times, right? And that we somehow identify mostly with the Roman military and or the specific times, but they had always been around and had always been used properly in the military. We have a law issued by Marcian. We are in 455, and we know this from the later Codex Justinianus, Book 4, Title 41, Section 2, prohibiting the export of lorice, the loricae. This is obvious. As you see here, the Codex was of the 6th century was, of course, referring to the fact that you couldn't quite export. It was a protectionistic measure to preserve, especially the finest pieces of panoply, like at least compared to the amount produced, like the loricae were likely the more made for the largest expanse. Swords were more costly, spatae were more costly, but they were also used relatively less in comparison. There were other sort of also more simply cheaper weapons, but don't think less effective, like the spear is always underrated in many ways. And this also shows you how, of course, there would be some officers or clerks in the military that would, of course, speculate, right? Would essentially trade Roman arms and armor, because also they were actually good quality, to say the least, for their own personal gain. Which means also that eventually there were arms and armor to spare, let's say, or at least to partially like sell, like hopefully without being punished for. Now, additionally, an abundance of iconographic and literary sources dating from the late 4th to the 6th century provide testimony to the extensive and uninterrupted use of a substantial amount of armor and protection by Roman soldiers. Again, this never came unless there was never like a moment in which we say, oh my god, here there's a collapse, right? This is not true even after the Roman state actually collapses, right? There are means to make things going on. Mostly it's how long late antiquity leaves on, but even after that you have more private means that still provide fine arms and armor, right? And mostly at that point we come to look at the elite finds. Just the other day I was making a video about the Herkerhet/Vestis Bellica in an early medieval context. So that, yes, it is true that later, after the exhaustion of antiquity, you have large swaths of the population get demilitarized in favor of the lords that become really the professionals and maintain the higher standards and have excellent weaponry. Think about Cassiodorus talking about the Gothic weapons. The Ostrogoths entering Italy were using the same Roman fabrice that had remained operating in the peninsula. And yet there was all pride, right? connected with ethnic weaponry, the Gothic swords. Especially the Goths had very, very powerful elites because the Romans had molded these people as such. And there was also a shift from Noricum to the Upper Rhineland as far as arms and armor production in at least Western Europe was sort of was better. Like this would be actually the Rhine blades, as you know, the finest ones throughout the early until essentially the 12th century in Europe. And there was an elite culture at that point kicking in by looking at, say, the extreme quality of a sword that was definitely wielded now by some sort of champions with, of course, an army, including the same Gothic one that in the rank and file fighter would have not been that overwhelmingly performing. Consider that when Belisarius crushes the Goths in Italy, the same Byzantine military had to recur to things like, I don't know, wooden armor, because metal protections were so expensive, and this material was so difficult to find. We are now in the mid-6th century. Really, there is a shift, like there is the Justinian plague, there is a further collapse, contraction, so things start going down. That's the point. Like the mid-6th century, you can argue that until essentially the mid-8th, likely troops were less armored than they had ever been in several centuries. But then things start increasing back again, medieval times that surpass, as you know, antiquity in level of armoredness. Now, these sources include artistic reproductions, such as those found in the Vergilius Vaticanus manuscript and the column of Arcadius in Constantinople. The latter is present just in later drawings, right? Whereas the Vergilius manuscript is actually, in fact, preserved at the Vatican Library. Sources about late Roman armor also include literary works by authors like Ammianus, Agathias, Julian, Claudian, and Procopius. Today we stop fundamentally to 5th century orientatively, but all these sources, like, of course, are useful comparatively. Nothing prevents you, as we've seen also with Pagetzius, to make considerations about what these authors knew about other eras. And these authors all demonstrate a consistent emphasis on the importance of armor in protection for Roman soldiers, unavoidably. So again, there is no... I don't want to make this video exclusively about what Pagetzius said about was less Roman armor. It's not true, because at least we shouldn't think that armor had somehow disappeared or decreased drastically. But in fact, it's also kind of obvious. Now, during the 3rd and the 4th centuries, a significant amount of iconographic evidence attests to the widespread use of lauricae amatae and squamatae, or lauricae amata and squamata, characterized by a notable tendency to extend the armor's extremities to protect the knees and elbows. Right? This is very interesting. In some instances, this protection extends to the head and neck, seen in the famous frescoes from Dura Europos, and in a drawing from the Vergilius Vaticanus, which featured chainmail hoods. Famously enough, we also used here the pictures in the video. People would tell you simply, well, you see, there's this great extension of armor. This means they had to parry themselves, especially against increased missile fire. Alright, so, armor does just that, by the way. This is not a correct interpretation. First of all, there is a consideration regarding the general level of armament you can afford and provide to troops as a state. For example, also the, late Republican Lorica Amata is longer than it had been in the previous centuries. Like, I mean, with the Marian reform that technically cheapened also a little bit the standard level of armament. Except, again, because there is also a matter of quality, right, of the material and the manufacture in general, not just how much this armor extends. However, during the 3rd and the 4th centuries, as we were saying before, there is that tendency towards a sort of a greater distinction between the elite and the sort of the more average troops. So what we see here is likely, first of all, the preeminence of sort of the best armor to show in art. Also, sometimes in a bit of an ideal way, and or in an artistically licentious one. On the other side, the fact that, again, the elite troops would have, of course, had a greater degree of armoredness that would stand out, that would actually sort of qualify them to some extent. Right, at some point we will, the best series, if you're interested in arms and armor, is the homonymous one, but there is also the military historical unit series that deals properly with the single details of what we know, like these troops were properly armed, like, and sort of how armor was technically built and so on. So we're not looking at this now, but these extensions give you an idea. But they're also not just because these troops, like the story that the Lorica Squamata was, or scale armor was more used in the East because it was more effective against, also the Lorica Segmentata against arrows. The Squamata may be in a general sense, but it's still an armor, right? It's not that they would have, if they had it, they produced it, for whichever the choice was also to make it in that structure, was just because they had to prepare themselves from arrows. Like also chainmail does that. Arguably worse, but to what extent? How do you mathematically or factorially calculate that in the first place, right? We find this armor pretty much everywhere, and some offer better protection, some was better manufactured, etc. So we just don't have an actual picture or of a Roman cohort in combat for us to understand how this type of protection was actually spread in the ranks, right, and distributed and located, etc. Obviously, like the first ranks would have been better armored, right? That much we know. But what kind of armor this was, did it even matter? Technically, it was orientatively would matter, but in practice, like the important thing, the essentials for a warrior, is to be either armored or unarmored, right? And more or less, the type of armor, the same, were pretty much, say, virtually equivalent to an extent, and there were also different material. And we know there were, Loricae segmentata of bronze. We found the actual pieces, fragments. There was actually leather armor. Again, the extent is debatable, but we are also fairly plenty of evidence throughout. Like, it's still few overall to fully reconstruct the picture, of course, but in absolute terms, it's really a lot from Roman iconography, archaeology, etc. The Lorica Squamata or scale armor appears to be gaining popularity even among higher-ranking individuals. Tolkien, at least in terms to what the Lorica Musculata had done in the past. If you look at centurions, from quite a while had been using the Squamata as well, was normally considered better armor than the Amata in general, or was just it was, say, if it is better, it's also heavier. There is all a cost to that, but in fact, this band can remember what we were saying before about those who can afford to use this kind of pamphlet, right? And just also in a monetary sense, but also mirrored at a career level, right? This was now a thing also among more troops apparently. We find the various loricae musculatae previously reserved for high-ranking figures now depicted as worn by ordinary soldiers, which is what we were saying before. Like if this was leather, for example, we would understand it. Was there a particular reason? Could be just an aesthetical one. There was maybe just that aforementioned. It was a matter of symbolism, right? This type of lorica had priorly been used by sort of heroic figures, and now there was a tendency to mix a bit more the values because the world seemed more upside down. But of course, these weren't like the heavy, also say very burdensome like plate armor, right, worn by the top heroes, just like in the Bronze Age, right? These were lighter types, and we could see, of course, in iconography, some motives, some, again, aestheticism pointing towards the idea that, yes, this could have been just an artistic license of some sort as well, not necessarily mirroring the actual use of so many lorica musculata, as a matter of fact. It is likely that the lamellar armors of Oriental origin were supplied to heavy cataphract cavalry. I made a video about lamellar armor. I made very old videos about Roman cataphracts that, as you know, weren't actually very successful. Like, the Roman military was very successful. The cataphract experiment was actually miserable by Roman military standards. They always got crushed in a way or another, and mostly because Rome was not a feudal society like the ones of the Iranian peoples that had produced this ultra heavy cavalry. Of course, there was some functional heavy cavalry of this type, but overall, like in major engagements, we know that they wouldn't make this great effect. Still, at this point, infantry, by the way, dominates the battlefields. The Romans also have pretty effective ways in turn to cope with Eastern cataphracts. So, there is a bit of that sort of, again, Hellenistic Byzantine vibe of let's throw in all this sort of more magnificent stuff, even though maybe it doesn't even work. Let's experiment. There's that sort of Hellenic mindset sort of lurking in the shadow, re-emerging at this point to this similar extent as in the past, prior to Roman times. We see a beautiful depiction of Roman cataphract in the graffiti from Dura Europos, right? At least that's how also an equivalent of Persia would have looked like. It's by the way that these specifically designed cavalry armors were developed and adopted also by infantrymen. This is important because, of course, the same cataphracts could dismount at a point. There was a lot of experimentation, telling the truth, and unfortunately we can't fully follow this technical development. For sure, like cataphract armament was also prohibitively costly, heavy, and so most of these experiments remain experiments. But of course, it was so we haven't quite pictured like probably what the heaviest Roman infantrymen could be at this point because of this greater variety, right, of soldierly types. But you would have probably been amazed by the various combinations. And speaking of lamellar armor, typically the slats were fastened with leather laces and textile backing. Lamellar was better for properly against arrows. This is at least what is commonly believed. Then again, this depended on the quality of the armor. Tendentially, that was true. It depended also on how the various slats were composed, imbricated, and made a series about Eurasian steppes warfare that passes through Roman times. Not specifically the late ones, but say we talk about also the Goths, the Huns. So there you have essentially the equivalent of what you could have found, the various varieties also among the Roman auxiliaries, and just outside the frontier in the Barbaricum. Speaking of the old so-called Lorica segmentata, characterized by its horizontal bands, this is depicted on monuments up to the time of Septimius Severus, so we are in the first decades of the 3rd century. Some people say that essentially the archaeological findings suggest that this type of armor was no longer in use by the mid-3rd century at the latest, but some more updated study actually showed that it would have not been, let's say, impossible for Diocletian's or Constantine's armies to have had, especially the former, some old Lorica segmentata, some design that was still produced here and there, because again, every place could also opt for a specific creation. This was a sort of proto-industrial reality for the level of militarization and standardization of the production, but it was still like a handcraft deal, and so you could customize the armament as well. In a sense, armor did simplify. Like there were certain helmets types, for example, evolving in the first half of the 3rd century, famously also coming to cover even the years. Most of those cavalry helmets that were heavier, bulkier, also hyper decorated. You could understand already there that these were sort of more important people that had ever been before, especially, we could say especially among cavalry, but say compared to what had been the case in the previous centuries. You see that after all, like in the Roman 2nd century, like armor had gotten at some levels very heavy, right? The tendency overall is to see in the 4th century the average trooper having substantially lighter armor, and in parallel with, as we've seen, the injection essentially of other elements that before would have been found in the same proportion, more or less, in the army, but as auxilia, right? And the sort of the finest equipment also specialized forces for more, I would say, individual sort of hand-to-hand fighting. If you look at the same concept of a Constantinian equus compared to an early 3rd century Roman cavalryman, you realize that the latter was still framed in a much larger machine, for which they even which is rare, by the way. And if you look especially at, I don't know, the imperial helmets in general, having this the ears covered, right, which is like very rare, because hearing orders is so vital, especially in such a heavily drilled and collectively trained formations. In later Roman times, what you have is apparently instead some elite guy that is designed to act, of course, like to fight in a unit, but ever more like with that knightly individual spirit, ethos. It's probably the type of weapons that increase this, that increase also in that elite the evident level of professional training of for example, multi weapons specialization, which is typical of late antiquity. Recruits were trained much more intensely than before, because they were now to be more adaptable and also to make a more effective use of combined arms. And this is mostly like what the Byzantine, and especially the early Byzantine manuals tend to stress. Made multiple videos also on archery training. Horse archery, for example, was not big deal in earlier Roman times. You would have been surprised by how present it actually was. But at this point, it properly finds a, say, regularized place in Roman tactics, and this entails all a specific technicality, the costs, again, recruitment. So this sort of more artificial, like sort of dirigistic and properly pre-planned, right, pre-modeled training type with all these specific means, technical means. So in part it's what we were saying before, like there was a less direct effort, like it could be in the one of an earlier Roman legionnaire, still conceived himself a bit as a warrior, more than we imagine. And now some more secularized, modernized mindset for which, okay, let's try to economize, let's try to rationalize, let's try to rely on technical means, on combined arms, and make the most out of also properly a material dimension, right? We see partial armor sets with metal components, particularly the manichae for the arms and analogous protections for the legs. It's also kind of normal, remaining used for an extended period, particularly among the horsemen that, as we were just saying, were also the main destinataries of such better equipment, tendentially, of course, especially the heavies. The manichae were actually a very old type of armor that existed since, like, before it became sort of iconic for the Roman military, mostly during Trajanic times, right? But gladiators had that before. The loot, the spolia of on the Pergamon altar, of course, show you that the beautiful manichae, especially connected with the Eastern cataphracts, Seleucid cataphracts, being defeated there. So there is actually, as you understand, a remixing. It's as if like a cauldron of different combinations, readaptations, mostly tending towards, again, the average lightening, but also the heavening at an elite level. Because of this intensification of the difference between arms, reflecting that also political and social imbalance that eventually will break the system. You see, it's as if the 4th century Roman army had sort of gotten the very best of these two elements combinations. The early Roman army had not even needed to develop too much this combined arms tactics, because the enemies that they fought against, the early Germans, the Parthians, were not so threatening at all. And so it was enough even just to have auxiliaries to defeat entire armies. And look at the Battle of Mount Graupius, literally. At this point, you have, again, the idea that this army has to be reformed, has to be reorganized about the 3rd century crisis, and it maintains still this structure for which you have, after all, a relatively even distribution of wealth among the general subtitans, but you have already enough social inequalities to have like an elite, and again, still have essentially infantry, it's a superiority, decisivity, but the greater punching effect of these other better trained, better equipped forces. And this system again holds essentially up to Adrianople. Right after that, you have a more unbalanced system, definitely something more makeshift, more emergential. It's not to say that again overnight, like Adrianople goes, who knows, won't. The same Goths were again Romanized and integrated in the army, and say more or less they also tactically speaking responded a bit to the same challenges, right, with the same purpose. But it's the state that becomes more becomes weaker, right? It is undermined by the presence of these peoples as entire chunks now within the same empire. You need to send them fighting against others. They become a military instrument in the same Roman hands. The Visigoths are fundamentally created as a people, as the Roman army of the Illyricum, not more, not less. That's also how true Germanic kingship, at least in a political and later territorial sense, unitarily emerges. Right? It's a product of Romanization. And so there you have mostly a struggle for resources that must develop for a different type of warfare that is best exemplified, at least by the peak right there of probably of Byzantine efficiency in this regard, say in the army of Justinian, of Belisarius. All right, so that is, which is, as you understand, a smaller, more diversified army, even a much less Roman army, like meaning that there are so many different Symmachoi / federati there, in proportion and in variety. You will see, like, if we have something coming about the 6th century imperial army, and we could appreciate that better. But it probably that army that is also like the one described in the Strategicon is the one that instead matches perfectly in an equal way and synergic, syncretic way Romanity and Hellenicity in that like respective practicality and intellectual superiority, right? And again, the army of the time of Justinian, if you read the Strategicon, how vibrant that is, right? Byzantine culture will eventually sclerotize. You read Leo's Tactica later on in the 9th century, you realize it's just copying the older model, nothing else, practically. And this is very relevant also to explain lots of things about the Byzantine art of war that we really have to enter much more in depth to. Now, in the De Rebus Bellicis, book 15, the autonomous author references to Thoracomachus, that was a type of garment made of wool or felt padding covered in leather, designed to be worn underneath actual armor. So this is padded armor, and this starts coming around as first, say, early mentions, because we do not see overwhelming, at least reference to padded armor in previous Roman times. This should actually make us open, a gigantic digression on the topic, and I promise I will make a video specifically on it. Because it does seem that at least the references are scarce. Previous times, actually padded armor was more widespread than we think, and the reason can be the generally lighter type of protection that required thus, like, rather than wearing no armor at all, like this padded one. Previous times, this Roman legionary would have had like a tougher armor that would have sort of even required actually wearing a padded armor underneath, but that was sort of more important than anything, and also sources did not really, were less also, in fact, Hellenic in nature than this sort of already more Byzantinely oriented culture literature would be willing to discuss. The Romans were much more brutally primitive and just about conquest, war, the actual self-actualization rather than the conceptualization, the contemplation of the same. It may be that there was, especially in the eastern part of the empire, more archery, especially with migration era movements of nomadic peoples that relied heavily on horse archery, and padded armor can do really miracles against most of those projectiles that will arrive spent at the wrong angle, and therefore, like, generally speaking, having this padded armor would have made things easier. There are surely other reasons connected with the general development of arms and armor and supplies and designs, but again, it's a bit more complicated than our time allows us, at least for today. Finally, it's likely that greaves were worn by heavy infantrymen in the front lines, as it had been the case already in the previous centuries, as both Vegetius and the Strategicon recommend their use, at least for late antiquity, for the same identical function, right? We can see that aside from the shields varieties, that actually shields would, like the oval one, had likely always remained the prevalent one in the Roman army, in spite of the square, like the shingle shape one being again more iconic, also in the propaganda monuments in Rome, etc. But we know also archaeologically, in the provinces things were slightly different, and we can see there even apologically like much of a greater variety. Again, the fact that we see this later authors talking more about, say, for example, greaves, for example, the spread in the use of the spear is another, among the legionary infantry is another, say, topic of contention, or at least it's not more than much, but there is this notion that, say, the early Imperial Roman legionnaire would just fight with a sword, right? And the spear was used, say, by the auxilia, by cavalry, but let's say the Roman legionnaire being just a sword, and that's not so true. It's true that later we find more spearmen among the regular Roman infantry that, as we've seen, however, is also lighter, so it would all, let's say, more lightly armored, which would of course require the trooper keeping the enemy more at distance with a longer weapon. We've seen it often also in medieval times, and the question, wasn't that happening among the auxilia? And so the average type of trooper that existed essentially at the time, the form of a spear warband, right, with maybe a side weapon in the sword, etc. But wasn't that also sort of a phalangitic type of warfare? People want to stress that in later Roman times, it's as if a bit of some sort of coming back to hoplitic style due to the Hellenic bases. Of course, it has no reality in here. It's mostly like the Germanic Fulcon, right, that makes the thing. But still, conceptually, right, a more similar type of warfare to the one of a phalanx makes also more similar equipment. And say, the greaves, like the ancient hoplites. But why? Because the Roman legionnaire swordmen had not used greaves. Wouldn't the auxilia or other spear warbands use like that kind of tactic? We don't technically know even how wide or narrow the Roman infantry order was. We just have a couple of sources telling us, respectively, for Republican times, essentially an open order, and for later times, like a close order. And that's all what we know. Like, there's no other evidence, aside iconographically, but it's also sketchy in a way, what would be the actual order, internal order of the Roman infantry. We just don't know, right? Nobody knows, right? There's not some alchemy behind us that can make you know. We weren't there. We haven't seen it, and things could also vary, of course, across the centuries. And there you have to answer, then, what kind of difference did this make in terms of weaponry? Of course, there are better hypotheses than others. I think the notion, for example, of the early imperial swordsman is fundamentally correct. There is also a specific reason why, right? There is a specific reason why, I don't know, also other peoples more primitively fought apparently naked. We were talking about the padded armor. Then why don't we see it before? Is it just a trope, or is it like a part of heroic nudity, or they actually didn't care because their type of warfare was much more aggressive, and it was not just going into battle, especially into hand-to-hand fighting in Western Europe between the Romans, the Celts, the Germans, that would make the difference if you were stabbed or something like that. It's debatable. We know that the subarmalis was there. We know, again, that probably there was much more organic stuff around than than we can, in fact, especially archaeologically, in fact, document, because that rotted away. And so you understand that all these question marks are probably leading us too much modernistically and secularistically astray from the actual substance of the actual beliefs of these peoples, the actual battle accounts, the fact that probably these armies did not vary excessively in terms, especially of things so simple in character like armor, like in terms of possibilities of development, right? Again, even just in strictly armored and unarmored terms, what makes the difference in military terms is just, in fact, whether you have that armor or not. Then if it's lamellar, if it's mail, if it is scale, does it really matter? How much does it matter? In a strictly, like at the unit level, right? In terms of the moral force of this unit, what they can do, their collective training, who commands them, what kind of experience they have. Is it really relevant? What kind of armor they had? And also about the actual level of armoredness overall. How much will have this varied, really, overall, right? It's just like the size of armies, more or less throughout history, it's sort of the same. At least in pre-industrial times, in this pre-industrial context, when it's mostly the political objective that dictates what you're gonna be like. In this sense, making the military instrument much more adaptable than we generally think, right? But also sticking to some strategic and tactical essentials, and in fact, wouldn't be so surprising at all, right? It would be relatively, unchanging in the essentials themselves. So there would be so much to say. I actually hate to make this. Now, these are actually more interesting videos than even the ones describing the actual pieces and types of armor, right? At least in my taste, like as a military historian, like have my reserves towards archaeology in a biased way, and the archaeologists have vice versa. But it's important to more than else frame, right, the picture. And so yes, it's sort of general dispersive thinking, but it should give you that idea of what say conventions and approximations are used for, and the fact that ultimately we just don't know to an important extent. I mean, we know, but we can't fully concretize that. It's more the idea at the end of the day that matters. And you can't understand the Roman military, of course, if you don't understand Roman history, politics, society, religion, culture, literature, language, by the way, because there are all terms that you should be able to approach also in the originals, as I always say, that make you really feel what these people are writing and why, more than else. Like, what is that the Jetsis really want? Right, that's mostly what people who read him and cite him today really don't, right? Because they're not someone living back in late antiquity, and there's just something you can't replicate. We will hopefully keep talking soon about the late Roman army. I mean, there is so much to it. Again, today we covered like very long time period. There is really a lot at so many different levels that can't quite be summarized in this videos, but again, there is always a lot of work to do as a consequence. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.